Hello, everybody. As you know, I am Santiago Castillo, and I will present you my literature review for the master thesis of the Masters of International Business. So today I'm going to show you, of course, the literature review of 5 different articles, academic articles, peer-reviewed, and as well the research question that I will make for my master's thesis of the MIB at EAFIT University. So first of all, I am Santiago Castillo, as you might know me, and I already had an article written and published that was based on the prospective effects of free trade agreement between Colombia and South Korea and the Colombian automotive sector. So this article was one of my inspirations in order to search for new topics regarding free trade agreements and global value chains. And basically this article was relating the influence of the global value chains and the free trade agreements in the automotive sector of Colombia, and how the global value chains basically interacted with the free trade agreements and were more important for the development of the industry than the actual free trade agreement. So I'm going to show you the 5 readings and then talk to you a bit more about this. So first of all, the first reading I made was entitled Rents, Power and Governance in Global Value Chains. It studied private and non-corporate actors and GVCs. It had quantitative and qualitative methodologies, so it was mixed. The sample they had were shipping costs and data from international organizations around the world, from academic articles and international organizations, in which they basically made a recompilation of different standards, competition policies, and economic rents through 3 case studies: food safety standards in GVCs, taxation policies, and competition policies. The results were they determined that lead firms govern the GVCs and the government's and civil society influence is not as important, so it has been constrained. The limitation I found out of this was that the case studies were from 3 different policies, and some other important policies were not taken into account. For the second reading, it was about least developed countries in a world of global value chains. Are WTO trade negotiations helping? So it talked about LDCs, WTO, GVCs, and trade policies. They had some mixed methodology in which they took government data in trade and WTO decisions, and information and reports from the OECD. And then the technique they had was gathering the official agreements and trade policies and comparing them to what was the actual result of that. So the analysis was this comparison between the policies and the results. And the conclusions of this article were that the future agenda for LDC's international regulation should be focused on supply constraint. Nimble industrial and trade policies as well can facilitate GVC's development, but policies should be focused on supply. And then some limitations are that the paper concludes that GVCs depend on the GVC and the country, so it was kind of broad in terms of the final results and conclusions. The third reading was trade costs and borders in global value chains. And this had a quantitative method about they studied global value chains and trade data, especially world input-output database and new income trade. And they created a new technique of cumulative resistance to exports in GVCs and a measure of the average number of border crossings that build on the intercountry input-output framework. So this analysis was a comparison between border crossing tariffs and GVCs, and they found out that first of all, they had new estimations for the relationship of liberalization and FTAs, and also they determined that liberalization neutralizes high risks of cumulative protection. Further on, I think they had a lack of further testing of the methods because it was only their method which was tested. The fourth one was circular economy and power relation in global value chains, tensions and trade-offs for lower income countries. They were qualitative. The sample were low-income countries. They had academic articles and an hermeneutical analytic technique, and it was based on global south countries and GVCs. They found out that disruption of GVCs and reduction of international trade volumes can accelerate the deindustrialization of LICs, But I found that their limitation was they only had 4 or 5 sources of information, so it was not enough. And finally, the last one was called Overlapping Free Trade Agreement and International Trade, a Network Approach. They had a quantitative method. The sample was trade info from 96 countries between 1960 and 2010. And the data collection was from Bayer and Bergstrand and the WTO databases, and they made a very strict network analysis, which is an econometric procedure. And they basically found out that FTAs have been positive overall in the last 15 years for trade, but signing multiple trade agreements with several trade partners can actually have a negative impact. So you must be selective. I found that the gap in the literature is that most articles are based in a certain country, certain FTA, or certain regional bloc. However, I think this is part of the state of the art. You cannot really give general conclusions for everything in this topic. But I can also see that most of the articles are from Southeast Asia, North America, and the European Union. In Africa, it's very limited, only South Africa. And in South America, it's extremely limited. I didn't actually find anything relevant on this topic. The focus is either on developed nations or least developed nations, but not like on developing and emerging nations. And then the studies are more emphasized in economy or government affairs, but not on trade per se. So I think it should be very interesting to have actually some trade data. And then, of course, this is done mostly case to case. Regarding my article, I really think that there was an influence here. So this plus the literature review opened up my research question, which has been more decisive in the Colombian international trade during the last 5 years, free trade agreement or global value chains. So this is taking into account that GVCs are market driven and FTAs are state driven. And this is a relationship between market phenomena and commercial diplomacy. I could also filter it a bit more regarding services or goods or in the Latin American or bilateral issues. But for the moment, I think that Colombian international trade during the last 5 years is specific enough in order to be able to research it. So these are my references, and thank you very much for watching.